The sky screamed, a soundless convulsion that rippled through the void. Across the cold expanse of space, sensors flickered, prayers stuttered, and data screens melted into white noise. The warp shivered like a thing alive. Then came the light, not the unnatural glow of chaos, but something cleaner, older. It burst through the black like a rainbow forged from lightning and steel. 1,000 ship crews went blind trying to comprehend it. The Adeptus Mechanicus chanted in static tones, invoking machine spirits that had never seen such purity. For a heartbeat, even the gods of the warp seemed to pause. The Bifrost Bridge tore through reality. Out of it stepped a figure that should not exist in this age. A broad-shouldered man clad in armor engraved with runes that burned like molten gold. His beard flowed like rivers of starlight. His single eye burned with the wisdom of dying suns, and in his right hand, he carried a hammer that hummed with the deep, patient growl of thunder waiting to be unleashed. He looked at the galaxy before him, at its broken empires and silent prayers, and for a long moment said nothing. The void answered him with static. Then his voice rolled across the stars like a tide of storms. "This is not Asgard," he said, his tone a quiet thunder. "But it remembers gods." The Imperium did not wait to ask questions. On the command deck of the inquisitorial battleship Unfaltering Edict, alarms screamed like angels being strangled. Inquisitor Melia Vorst stood unmoving as the image resolved on her holodisplay. The armored stranger floating above a dying world, untouched by gravity or logic. His presence made the void itself seem too small. "Manifestation class?" she asked, her voice cold as vacuum. "Unclassified," murmured Muggos Hecateer beside her, servo arms twitching in agitation. "Energy readings exceed any known demon signature. Not warp-based. It bends the machine spirits themselves. They are singing." Vorst frowned. "Demons do not make the machine sing." Her fingers brushed the trigger rune on her command throne. "Fire a warning volley." Lances of light licked the void, each beam enough to cauterize a continent. They struck the air around the figure, and stopped. The light folded like cloth, wrapping around invisible runes that glowed in midspace. The stranger's head turned slightly, as though he were listening to a song only he could hear. Then, gently, he waved his hammer. The energy collapsed into sparks and faded into snow. Vorst stared. By the throne. Oden, for it could be none other, looked toward the source of the attack and smiled faintly, a smile that carried no malice, only patience. "Fear makes poor introductions," he murmured. Then he began to descend, walking through the air as though the stars themselves bent to carry him. He landed on the barren planet below, a cracked world of dust and bone, long stripped of life by war. Around him, the wind moaned through ruins that still remembered their screams. The Inquisition came to meet him. Drop barges fell like iron angels, slamming into the ground and vomiting out soldiers. Sisters of battle in black armor polished with faith, Scutarii whose limbs sang binary hymns, and inquisitorial acolytes carrying relics heavy enough to kill faithless men. They formed a circle around him. The air smelled of oil, incense, and holy terror. Oden watched them all with a calm that made even the fearless hesitate. "Identify yourself," barked Inquisitor Vorst, striding through the ranks. Her armor gleamed under the pale stormlight. "By the Lex Imperialis, all entities of unknown origin are subject to purgation. Speak or be unmade." Oden regarded her with a faint curiosity. "You carry law as a shield. Law is a fine shield, until the wind changes. I am Oden, son of Bor, breaker of oaths and keeper of them. I do not come for war." His gaze turned toward the horizon, where the air trembled like a curtain before lightning. "But war comes for all things." Vorst gestured sharply. "Open fire." Bolters roared. Energy beams screamed. The plateau vanished in a storm of smoke and heat. When the air cleared, Oden was still standing, surrounded by a soft shimmer of blue light. The ground beneath him glowed with runes that burned brighter with every bullet that struck them. He sighed, and the sound was old as the first frost. "I asked for peace," he said. "Now I must speak in your language." He raised Mjolnir. The hammer sang, not as a weapon, but as thunder remembering its purpose. The shockwave rolled through the ranks like an ocean, sending armored soldiers tumbling yet leaving their bodies unbroken. Energy rifles melted into slag. Skitarii augmetic sparked, their machine spirits overwhelmed by reverence, not rage. The ground itself seemed to kneel beneath him. Yet Oden did not strike to kill. His strength was controlled, measured, almost sorrowful. Then the warp tore open. A red wound split the air, bleeding fire and brass. From it poured creatures of muscle and rage, bloodletters, their swords burning with hatred given form. The storm howled with laughter that was not laughter, and the name corn echoed in the wind like a curse. All gods fall, hissed a demon with eyes of molten hate. All thrones bleed. Odin's eye narrowed. We shall test that. The first demon lunged, blade carving air. Mjolnir met it, and the sound was not metal but destiny colliding with defiance. The creature exploded into dust. Others swarmed. Oden moved like lightning wearing flesh, every motion a poem written in violence and grace. The ground cracked under the weight of gods. Each swing of his hammer lit the sky with silver flame. The Inquisition's guns fell silent. The soldiers watched, awed despite their training. Even Vorst lowered her weapon for a heartbeat as Oden waded through the tide of demons like a storm given form. His power was not chaotic, it was ancient order, the kind that existed before law had words. When the final bloodletter fell, the warp scar twisted shut, its edges sizzling in defeat. The world fell silent again, save for the hiss of cooling metal. Oden rested Mjolnir against the ground and looked up, not at the humans but at something far beyond them, something only he could feel. His voice softened. I see you, Emperor of Man, he whispered. A god bound by your own creation. You hold the fire that burns your people, yet you are caged by their prayers. The others did not understand, but the void did. Somewhere, deep within the warp, a golden light flickered, faintly like a dying candle acknowledging another star. Oden turned back to the mortals before him. His gaze was steady, his tone gentle. I will not harm you. But if this world wishes for peace, it must first learn to stop mistaking fear for faith. Vorst stared at him, her will like tempered steel. You will answer to the Emperor. Oden smiled, not mockingly, but with the kind of respect one god gives another. Then perhaps I already have. Far above them, unseen by all but him, the last shimmer of the Bifrost faded into the void. And something ancient and cunning, something that loved change and chaos, began to watch. The silence after the demons died felt thin, like skin stretched over something still breathing. Heat lace shimmered above the scorched stone, and the air bore the mingled fragrances of incense and promethium. Sisters of Battle reloaded on instinct more than need. Skitarii recalculated their own faith in binary. Inquisitor Melia Vorst held herself upright as if she could pin the moment to the ground by refusing to blink. Oden rested the head of his hammer on the rock and looked at her as if weighing whether this place knew how to listen. You will come under protection and question, Vorst said, the words clipped clean enough to cut. You will be warded and bound. I have been bound, he answered softly, and there was winter in the way he said it. It taught me how to value the unbound. His eye drifted upward again, past cloud, past the visible, toward a pressure only he seemed to hear. Your emperor is a man holding back an ocean with his own body. I will not insult his labor by pretending your chains could hold me long. Servoskull's word. Muggos Hecateer took a step closer, voice a cautious him. Entity designating itself Oden. Accept hexagrammic containment for the duration of transit and inquiry. My oaths compel me to advise this, politely. Oden turned his head toward the Muggos and smiled with the tired fondness of an elder who recognizes the shape of a younger creature's duty. Draw your star, priest of machines. Bind my shadow if it calms your logic. I will step into it of my choosing, and I will step out just the same. A low thunder rolled the dust. Not thunder. Engines. 3 gunships broke cloud with the arrogance of predators who wear their own scars as livery. Their hulls bore teeth runes and cloaks of chain, pelts nailed over ceramite with the care of men who remember the warmth of animals. The ramps fell before they had finished landing, and the space wolves came out laughing like men who had been told the world was ending and decided to race it. They didn't aim guns first. They looked. They saw the runes still smoldering where Oden had stood. The dust bled to glass by the hammer's breath. The dead no longer there because demons leave only problems. Their leader tugged off his helm and tucked it under his arm. Gray hair braided back with small bones and iron nails. He had a mouth made for grinning and a gaze that had learned sorrow without becoming small. "All-Father," he said in a Fenrisian growl that had taught Low Gothic to pick its teeth. "If you are a lie, you are the most beautiful lie I have seen." Vorst snapped toward him. "Battle leader, you will defer. I have authority." He lifted a hand without looking at her. Tribute rather than dismissal. "I, Inquisitor." "You do. You also have eyes. And if you use both, you'll see what I see." He turned back to Oden, and his grin thinned into respect. Scori half-mirth of the rout. "My priests smelled old snow in the warp and said your name with a straight face for the first time in their lives. Will you drink with us, or will you make me sit on a rock and listen sober to my own stories about you?" Oden's laugh was the sound a kettle makes when it decides to call a storm inside. It warmed the cold edges of the plateau. "Bring drink," he said, and then to Vorst, "and your wards. We will make a circle anyone here can live inside." Skitarii stamped out a precise hexagram in the dust, each line dusted with iron filings and sanctified salt. Sisters planted icons at the points. A servo skull traced sigils of binding and incense with a spidery pen it had never expected to use for a god. Oden stepped into the shape and felt it settle around him like a polite coat. The wards nipped his shadow and held it obedient. The man did not move differently at all. They built a small fire from the things that would not mind burning. Spent casings, splintered pallets from a half-buried drop cache, an altar that had lost its saint and wanted work. The space wolves drew out a cask with a dent that told a tale and horn cups carved with badly drawn beasts. A sister watched them with a look that was almost scandal and almost relief. Scori poured for Oden first, then for Vorst with a courtliness so rough it looped around to elegant. The first swallow hit like a friendly blow. Oden's eye kindled. For a while, language loosened. Warmth got in where habit kept its armor. Scori told a story about a boy who ate a fish that bit him back in his dreams until he learned its name, and then they stopped fighting in their sleep. As Skitarii Beta, politely ignoring that she had a heart, confessed she could hear the hum of Mjolnir like a machine litany but with feelings. A sister of battle quoted scripture at Oden and he quoted a poem back, and neither poem was weaker for sharing air with the other. When the quiet came back, it came with a new shape. The rune priest came then. Old, with the patience of a man who had listened to storms until they forgot they were alone. He set the tip of his staff on the rope marks the Skitarii had made in the dust and listened with his face. "You carry a road with you," he said to Oden. "And a tree. And a wound that taught you to bargain with yourself." He tilted his head like a wolf catching a far sound. "Do you hear him?" Oden's gaze went through the fire, the people, the stone, and laid a hand, light as a thought, on the far horizon of things. "Yes. But not as a man hears a voice. As a sailor hears ice cracking under the keel, and knows the ship is wider than the water that holds it." "That's Terra," Scori said, as if the word were a mountain you had to look up at. "We can take you to Fenris first, if you like. To be sung to properly before we decide whether we're all fools. Or we can throw dice until somebody makes a prayer of it." Vorst had not relaxed. She had learned how to smile and keep her spine wired to duty. "We go nowhere without sanction. You, Astartes, will submit your logs. You," she said to Oden, "will be interviewed by authorized Psychana. The Ordo Malleus will decide what your existence means." Oden set his cup down as if that, too, were a kind of promise. "What I am will continue to be what it is while councils debate its meaning. That is the curse and the kindness of being. But I will humor your ritual of caution. I will wear your sanction like a traveler wears a cloak others trust." Wind shifted. Not a meteorological thing. The kind of draft that moves when a door somewhere else opens. The fire guttered sideways, then straightened in defiance. Clouds, if they were clouds, formed angles too exact for weather, then softened as if embarrassed to have been caught doing mathematics. Across the ruin-studded plain, a broken cathedral took a breath, Empty windows blinked. A bell with no tongue chimed in a rhythm that made the skin think of questions it had loved before it learned language. Oden's eye hooded. "Changer," he said, very quietly. The rune priest's lips peeled back from teeth that were not afraid and not wise enough to be cautious. "Tsench," he spat, and the name smoked on the air. Geometry forgot itself at the edge of the world and tried to remember. The Skitariai's auspex drew a square and kept drawing it until it was a circle and then a trap. The sisters heard whispers in the cadence of their own prayers, asking them to move one step left. One step left would have put a boot in a line the hexagram could not forgive. Hecatier clamped a servo hand on a novice's shoulder and kept her where she was by inventing a new rule and loving it immediately. "Stand still," Oden said, and the word went through the camp like a stake through fabric, pinning them to a better shape of quiet. He raised his hammer very slightly and the runes in the dust brightened, not with power but with kindness, and that was a distinction the Mechanicus records would not enjoy later. He did not strike. He wrote in the air with his free hand. Not letters. Not even runes. He wrote a rhythm. A walking pattern that remembered the way to cross a river you could not see the bottom of. "March," he told the Skitarii, and when they hesitated because the order hadn't come from their chain of command, he added, "As if you were telling a story with your feet." The beta who could hear machines breathe took the first step. Then another. The auspex's false square tried to become a whole and found itself filled by a stanza. Sisters joined, their litanies bending, not breaking to match. The circle in the dust didn't mind. It liked music. It had been made of math, but it liked being made of memory for a minute. Angles gathered in the ruins, wings tucked inside them. A flock of birds that were numbers tried to take to the air and found their feathers imagined into ravens with real shadows. Oden watched them with a look that was not anger, only sternness. "Not yours," he told the air that wanted to be a maze. "Not yet." The cathedral exhaled and went back to being dead stone. The bell forgot its question. The wind remembered it was only wind. A long minute later, the fire crackled as if clearing its throat and declared itself a fire again. Everyone breathed, which is to say everyone noticed that they had been holding their breath and chose not to. Vorst's eyes had not left Oden. They were the same color as a horizon you can't quite decide is storm or morning. "You will come," she said, not softer, but closer to something like gratitude disguised as command. "We will move you under guard. The nearest shrine world has a stable navigator route. From there," Scori cut in, "we see if you're the guest we've been toasting all our lives. There's room on my Thunderhawk for a god and for an inquisitor. It'll be tight. That's how you know it'll be worth the flight." Hecatier, who loved good problems like a starving man loves bread, bobbed slightly. "I will accompany, Inquisitor. Data integrity requires first-party observation." One servo arm tapped the hexagram in the dust. "And I would like to know why this pattern purred." Oden rose. The wards held his shadow a heartbeat longer, then let it go as if embarrassed by its own boldness. He stepped toward the gunship ramp and paused, head cocked to one side, listening with more than ears. Somewhere far and near, the fabric of the Bifrost made a sound like silk being rubbed between thoughtful fingers. Something clever and patient had found an edge and begun to fray it. He looked at the faces around him, the woman who would burn a world to keep a candle lit, the warrior whose laughter knew when to stop, the priest who loved numbers so fiercely they sometimes forgave him, the sisters who wore their doubts under their armor like saints wear ribs. "Stay close to one another," he said. "Stories get lost when they try to walk alone." They boarded. The ramp came up with a sigh heavy as a curtain after the last act. Engines wound from growl to promise. As the gunship lifted, the plateau fell away, a circle of scuffed dust and cooling metal and a small fire that refused to be told it was too small. The world below looked like a jaw that had forgotten how to chew. Above, the clouds nodded and then unknotted themselves in the strange, fussy way of a thing being watched by a mind that loves puzzles. Scori buckled in across from Oden, helmet in his lap, eyes bright with a boy's awe hiding inside a killer's competence. Vorst sat upright, hands resting on her knees, Rosetta hard little sun at her throat. Hecatier muttered to a cogitator slate, tracing a waveform that looked like the memory of a song. The rune priest shut his eyes and smiled like a man who had found the beginning of a path that would only break his heart if he walked it properly. The Thunderhawk's nose tipped toward the stars. Behind them, where the Bifrost had been, the air shimmered once, like a hand waved goodbye through water. Ahead, the void opened its mouth. Somewhere between the two, a whisper not entirely meant for mortal hearing curled around Oden's ear in a voice made of questions. He did not answer it. Not yet. The gunship's hull rattled like a drum remembering a song as it broke atmosphere and climbed. The sky fell away, then the world, then the last honest curve of horizon. Stars took over with their old, patient indifference. Inside, the harnesses creaked and the breathing of armored men filled the gaps between engine notes. Scory watched Oden the way a hunter watches the first snowfall. Part calculation, part gratitude. Vorst kept her spine wired to duty and her hands still on her knees, as if any sudden motion might invite blasphemy. Hecateer made a small cathedral of data on a slate and prayed to it with his thumbs. They docked to a strike cruiser whose prow had been beaten into the likeness of a wolf's skull. Runes crawled along its ribbed spine like scars deciding they were ornaments. Boarding clamps took hold with the finality of a sentence. When the ramp fell, the ship breathed them in. Oil and iron, meat and smoke, the ghosts of 1,000 songs sung too loudly. The space wolves did not bring them to a cell. They brought them to a hall that had been a cargo deck before someone decided it should also be a memory. Chain-hung banners told stories with spilled drink stains and knife cuts. A hearth big enough to warm bad decisions glowed along one wall. Men laughed because that is how they kept the world from thinking too highly of its own darkness. Sisters of battle kept to the edges, faces bare and bright, eyes like candles in windless rooms. Servitors poured from dented casks. The air did the work of loosening armor that prayer could not. Scory put a cup in Vorst's hand with a care that made it clear he'd also be the first to shoot it out of her grasp if she reached for the wrong lever later. He offered Oden a bowl carved with wolves so badly drawn they had almost become fish. Oden drank as if giving a blessing back to the drink. They wanted proof the way all believers do when something larger than belief sits down at their table. Not the proof of power. Everyone had seen the hammer. Another kind, the one that came from the shape a man's silence left. Scory's scald, a narrow fellow with a mouth that smiled at trouble first, asked a question without asking. He tapped a dagger on the table. What is the oldest thing you have ever forgotten and then remembered? Oden thought a long time in a way that did not make anyone impatient. The sound my mother made when she laughed, he said at last. And how a promise tastes like iron until it tastes like bread. The Skald let out a breath like a man who had just put his feet back on the correct path in the dark. Vorst's retinue wheeled in a portable hexagrammic dais and a Psychona chair shaped to convince minds they had chosen to sit. A sanctioned psyker with eyes rimmed in salt stepped forward. With authority, Vorst said quietly. Oden nodded as though agreeing that rain should be wet. He sat. The chair tried to bite and found its teeth politely checked. The psyker touched Oden's brow and let the sea in. It came on in green-black plates of memory, a tree with 9 roots drinking from 9 secrets, a rope that taught compassion by teaching pain, a wolf that did not hate the hand that bound it. The chair trembled. The psyker bled, not red, but a thin shimmer like dawn caught and wrung out. Oden reached, not to stop the vision, but to give it a rail to hold. Easy, he murmured, and the man's breathing found its way home. Vorst watched, a dozen contingencies falling from her fingers like coins. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Gratitude had already written itself around the corners of her posture where only trained eyes would see it. They were still, almost comfortable, when the ship remembered it was in the warp. Geller harmonics juddered, a bass tremor through bone and rivet. The hololithic star map in the hall woke of its own will, throwing a scatter of light across the deck. Stars became points, became lines, became a labyrinth. Corridors on the projection narrowed until they were threads, then curved until they were no longer paths but questions. The navigator howled somewhere behind adamant doors and old sigils. In the hall, it arrived in smaller ways. The taste of copper that wasn't there. The sensation that if you looked over your shoulder you would catch your own childhood standing behind you, scared and unbruised. Tsench did not announce itself. It suggested. Sisters felt their litanies pick up an extra syllable that did not belong to any known saint. Scutarii auspex began to plot courses that would return to the same unmade room. Hecate's slate flattened its own waveforms into a smile and refused to stop. Scory's jaw set. His free hand curled as if closing around a throat older than stars. Oden stood, the Psychona chair forgetting it was supposed to hold him. He did not lift the hammer. He lifted his right hand and drew a shape in the air that had no edges and could not trap a thing. It was a spiral a fisherman makes when coiling line he trusts. He began to speak in a voice so low it could only be heard by listening past hearing. The rune priest beside him understood the rhythm even if the words slid away like clean ice. He added his own, Fenrisian, yes, but older too, the kind of old that still remembers when warmth was a negotiation with the sky. The hololith flickered. Labyrinth lines tried to be proud of themselves and failed. The navigator's howl dipped, found a pitch that didn't shear the inside of men's teeth. Hecate's slate lifted one waveform like a hand-braking surface and held it there, wet and grinning. The sisters felt the extra syllable fall out of their prayer and land like a beetle that rights itself and scuttles away because it has work to do somewhere that isn't here. Oden let the spiral sit in the air. It turned lazily, unthreatened, a reminder of circles that close not to trap but to keep warmth in. He glanced up through deck and bulkhead and 1,000 meters of machine and saw the navigator crouched on his couch, third eye staring into a storm of arithmetic. Your burden is to look and not be unmade, he said to a mind that would never hear the words but would feel the company. The storm stepped back one pace. It would step forward again, of course. Change cannot help itself. But the space between steps got wider. The vox crackled with the relieved profanity of a mortal who had expected to drown and instead found his boots wet. Then the tone cut to formal. A choir of no-nonsense voices. Astropaths, armored in prayer. Distress. Shrine world albedo sanctus. Pilgrim district geometry compromised. Cathedra read as recursive. Choir reporting sermons converting into numbers during utterance. Planetary defense grid holding against void incursion. None. Repeat. None. Threat is conceptual. Requesting immediate aid from any Imperium ship not currently dead or stupid. Scory looked to Vorst. Vorst looked nowhere but made a decision that made rocking horses of 24 careers. Plot course, she said. We answer. We go through the shoals, the rune priest warned. The warp's mood there is capricious. I can keep our keel. I don't know if I can keep the weather from asking questions we don't like. Oden rolled the spiral smaller between finger and thumb and tucked it into the torch bracket above the hearth. It hung there like something fragile that had decided to be brave. I have walked roads that asked worse and meant better, he said. I will sit with your helmsman and tell the storm a story. Sometimes that's enough. Hecate stepped closer, the eagerness of a man who loves clever machines briefly overpowering the caution of a man who also loves his life. The pattern you placed in the air, it does not bind. It suggests compliance? No cooperation. It reminds, Oden said. Binding is for enemies. Reminding is for cousins who got lost on the way home. The ship turned, as much as a thing that large and that certain can be said to turn in a medium that is mostly argument. The choir on the vox began a hymn that had never met a metronome and had no need to. The hall quieted. Men buckled harnesses, finished drinks, made small, private gestures toward luck that did not look like faith but were. Vorst stood beside Oden like a cliff's edge stands beside a sea, neither yielding, neither offended by the other's nature. Translation pitched the stomach and wrung the lungs in the way the warp always does when it insists on being noticed. The Geller fields hummed. The spiral in the torch bracket spun a little faster. Oden shut his eye and opened the other one, the one that isn't there, and for a moment the ship was a boat under a sky that was not a sky but a lid. Beyond it, far as a word never spoken, something golden burned without flame. He saw a chair that was a tomb and a battery and a promise broken across itself to make a bridge. He saw hands that had held worlds now clenched around the last small virtue of not letting go. He saw a man who was no longer a man paying a tax no empire could afford, and doing it every day because there were no other days. His face, when he opened his eye again, held a sorrow too old to complain and too honest to pretend it was anything else. They came back to real space with a lurch the size of a cathedral. Albedo Sanctus filled the display, a devout marble of a world, oceans black-blue with pilgrimage ships, continents crosshatched with roads worn by 1,000 knees. Orbit held quiet. No enemy fleets. No claws on the hull. But the auspex painted the surface in figures that refused to sit still. Streets that had been straight now curved back to their own doors. A basilica's nave folded into a spiral that led nowhere and everywhere and then settled on both. Vox from the surface carried hymns that rhymed with equations, tears running down voices that were trying to be brave and breaking into beautiful instead. Scori looked to Oden with the peculiar hope of men who have run out of ammunition and discovered they still have courage. Vorst spoke before he could. We land on the cathedral spire. We secure the choir. We hold the Pilgrim District line, if the concept of a line still qualifies. We do not yield doctrine to riddles. We tell the riddle a better riddle, the rune priest muttered, baring his teeth at the planet as if it would be comforted by honestly delivered hostility. Oden lifted his hammer, not as a threat, but as a promise. Walk close, he said again, same as on the plateau, same as he would say until someone else could carry the line. Stories get lost when they try to walk alone. Drop bays opened. The ship exhaled wolves and saints and the stubborn love of men who refused to let meaning be stolen. As the first thunderhawks peeled off toward the shining, bending city below, the spiral over the hearth turned once more and settled, as if a small thing had decided for now to be enough. The descent burned the clouds into white ribs and showed a city that had forgotten how to be itself. Streets curled back to their own doorsteps, bridges found the wrong river halfway across, and a basilica's shadow bent one way while the stones beneath it leaned another. Vox traffic bled prayers into palindromes. Somewhere below, a choir clung to a hymn that kept changing its mind about the next note. Thunderhawks knifed through crosswinds that were really arguments. Machine spirits grumbled and obeyed because they respected pilots who swore at them with love. The cathedral spire rose like a spear someone had tried to turn into a question and failed. They hit the upper buttress hard enough to make the stained glass flinch and spilled into a courtyard already busy with courage. Sisters of Battle held a gate that wanted to be a circle. Every time they reloaded, the arch changed saints. A canoness with a face carved out of resolve met them with a nod that did not have time for gratitude. Pilgrim districts are folding, she reported, voice steady around the ragged edges of reality. Our sermons take the long way before they reach our mouths. The choir is still singing. For now. Oden moved through the gate and the gate remembered it was a gate. The rune heat that followed him teased geometry into honesty. He passed a row of statues that blinked one after the other like a ripple through stone and kept their eyes shut when he looked at them because being seen by certain people makes even marble decide to behave. Vorst matched pace at his shoulder, every step a signed warrant. Scori rolled his shoulders once, the way wolves do just before deciding to be useful for a few hours. The rune priest's staff found purchase on flagstones that had misplaced their own seams. He tapped a tempo that refused to get lost. Inside the nave the sound was a machine built of lungs. The choir had braced themselves into a human engine, every rib a strut, every throat a held line. Their conductor kept time with a broken baton and the certainty that time exists only if you insist hard enough. Numbers crept up the music like frost, turning the vowels to blades. Hecatier stared at his auspex, saw waves becoming grids, and whispered apologies to the graphs as if that would release them from a promise they hadn't made. Oden didn't raise the hammer. He raised his left hand and clapped once. The sound landed like a foot on a ferry's plank. He clapped again, slower, then faster, then found the choir's heartbeat hiding under the fear. A meter took shape, old and walking, the kind sung by farmers who knew the way home by the rhythm their fathers had stamped into roads. The choir caught it, grudging then glad. Numbers slid off the notes and fell like beads that had never been strung properly. The conductor laughed without meaning to and chose to keep laughing because it worked. A sister stumbled as the floor tried to become a slope toward nowhere. Oden stepped, set Mjolnir's head down, and the tiles remembered they were meant to carry weight. He looked up. High above, where the vaulting met its own hesitation, frescoes of saints trading miracles for wounds breathed. Paint looked wet with a choice it had not expected to make. The rune priest murmured in Fenrisian, and the frescoes agreed to wait their turn. The way to the sanctum should have been a straight line you could count in candles. Instead, the aisle zigged into an ambulatory that opened into a cloister that presented a corridor already seen from another angle. Vorst halted long enough to be furious, and then did the most disciplined thing she had done that day. She put a hand on Oden's arm instead of a command in his face. "What rule do we use," she asked, "when the rules won't stand still?" "Tell the place a story about itself," he said. "Tell it the oldest version." He drew a quick nod in the air, a child's charm taught by an ancestor who had been tired and right. It was not a rune for power. It was a knot for remembering. Hecateer winced at the lack of symmetry and then realized he loved it more for that. They walked, not by sign, not by line, but by meaning. Left toward the wolf pelt that had always hung there even on days when it hadn't. Right toward the reliquary that remembered a woman's hand more than the bone inside it. Down the steps and then not down the steps because those steps had been added later by someone who put beauty where function already stood fine. The city tested them with corridors that tried to sell them better versions of themselves. The sisters ignored flattery with professional ease. The space wolves laughed at it until it got bored. Vorst kept her eye on the door that was not moving and arrived at it by refusing to accept that it could be anywhere else. They reached the sanctum and found the choir's root, a vox altar humming with a signal that had learned to kneel. It had been carved from shipwreck wood hauled across centuries, and the grain still knew what it was to float. The scholar priest assigned to it had bled his thumbs dry on the dials and kept going because pain is cheap and meaning is not. He did not look up when Oden approached, not because he did not want to see, but because he had decided his seeing was better spent on the work in front of him. Oden laid his palm on the wood. The altar's hum flared to a chord that hit the bones between breath and speech. He did not call. He didn't need to. A light answered anyway, far as star memory, close as the inside of a held hand. He stood at the edge of a room that was not a room. There was a chair that punished itself by existing. There was a will nailed to duty until the nails had forgotten their first purpose and had become part of what held the world up. He did not see a face. He saw the labor the face had chosen. It reached him like heat through iron. For a heartbeat so clean it might have been a mistake. Two burdens recognized each other. Oden did not kneel. The thing on the throne did not rise. They traded a courtesy older than altars. "I know what you carry. I will not make it heavier." When he came back to himself, his hand was still on the wood and the scholar priest had stopped bleeding. Vorst had not moved, but something small and lacerating in her had put down its knife. She hid it well. Scori watched Oden the way men watch the weather they love most when it is at its most dangerous. With a grin he could no longer help. The world noticed they had been allowed to make a promise inside it and decided to object. From the clear story spilled a flock of shapes that were not birds but wore the idea of birds into the air anyway. Feathers like numbers, eyes like answers waiting to be asked. They wheeled in patterns that could cut a man into proofs. The canonist barked a command and the choir stopped singing at once, which is harder than stopping a fall after you've begun it. Silence landed heavy, and the flock hesitated, unarmed by the absence of rhythm to weaponize. Oden did not strike them. He whistled, 2 notes the color of winter water, and 2 shapes every saga knows answered out of nowhere and everywhere. Ravens with a knowledge older than letters. They swept up, black on impossible blue, and the number birds broke like sums meeting poetry spoken by someone who meant it. Feathers fell that were also equations and hit the floor as dust that had the decency to be only dust. "Enough," Vorst said, voice level, partly to the air and partly to her own pulse. "We hold the sanctum. We evacuate the pilgrim districts in order of instability. We do not attempt debates with architecture. We move doctrine by deed. The districts won't stay evacuated if the streets keep deciding to introduce themselves to the same houses 3 times, the rune priest growled. He touched the staff to the floor and felt the shape of the city flex, then flex back because it had been told it was still loved. We cut to the heart or the heart cuts us to pieces we don't recognize. Oden lifted Mjolnir, not high, and it hummed with the satisfaction of a tool about to be used for the thing it had always known it was made for. He faced the door that led inward and outward and sideways all at once. "The changer is not offended," he said. "It is amused. Amusement is the most dangerous mood a clever enemy has. We will bore it." Scory's teeth showed. Bored gods make mistakes. He slapped a fresh mag into a gun that had never met boredom and respected it anyway. "Lead on." They stepped back into the nave and discovered the nave had decided to become three knaves arguing about which one had the better light. Oden cut through the argument by refusing to have it. He walked as if the world had always been this way and would always be this way no matter who tried to convince it otherwise. The sisters set flanking screens that moved like prayer bead strings through fingers. The Scutarii marked corners with chalk sigils invented 10 seconds ago that still carried the smell of usefulness. Hecateer kept pace, eyes bright, drawing lopsided knots that worked because the city understood sincerity better than precision. They reached the pilgrim quarter and found a street curled into itself like a frightened animal. Families clutched bundles of relic cloth and bread and each other. A child cried like a violin tuning itself badly. A priest tried to be everywhere and chose, admirably, to be somewhere completely instead. Oden went to his knees in the dust before the weeping child and offered the hammer's haft as a thing to hold. Not for magic, just because it was heavy and honest and warm where his hand had been. The child quieted. His mother did not know whether to be afraid and decided, correctly, to be busy. The way forward uncurled one cobblestone at a time, shy as a friend coming back after a foolish argument. From the corner of the quarter a tower lifted its head and tilted it, curious. Its bells rang a riddle. The words tried to choose them and found themselves tricked into being only words. The rune priest laughed once, sharp, and laughed again, gentler, and the tower looked embarrassed and stuck to itself. A shadow folded out of a creche of angles high above, too smooth to be natural and too smug to be kind. It glanced down like a hand across the surface of water, and everywhere it touched, doubt wrinkled. Oden watched it pass and marked the way it avoided a certain alley that had never been important until the moment a clever thing decided it wasn't worth its time. He turned his steps toward that refusal, and the city rewarded the impudence by letting them through. By the time the sun remembered where to stand, the choir had their hymn back and the vox altar carried it like a bridge. Evacuation lines walked instead of ran. The canoness negotiated with the laws of triage, the way hard people talk to hard gods. Scory left 2 squads to be beautiful, which is to say reliable, and took the rest forward. Vorst issued warrants to reality in batches, and the world obeyed enough of them to count as a working day. At the last gate before the labyrinth proper began, Oden paused. The air ahead smelled like blue chalk and old promises. He looked at the faces gathered, saint women with their mouths set like borders, machine priests whose love of truth didn't mind getting dirty, killers who sang when no one was listening, an inquisitor who had discovered that certainty can be sharpened by respect. "Close," he said, "not louder, just deeper. Walk close. Stories get lost when they try to walk alone." The gate took a breath, as if to tell them it had always been a mouth. They stepped through. The city smiled with too many teeth and opened into a maze that had been waiting a long time to meet travelers who could teach it to be bored. The maze began politely, which was its first lie. The first corridor leaned only a little, the first arch dipped just enough to bow without kneeling, and the first turn offered 2 choices that were both technically forward if you were generous with your definition of mercy. They moved as a single animal, breath matched, steps counting the same stubborn rhythm Scory's scald had beaten into the table back on the ship. The sisters took the flanks with their litanies set to the hum of the vox altar in the sanctum, keeping doctrine like a lantern cupped against wind. The Scutarii marked corners with chalk knots that didn't sit right in Hecateer's mathematics, and therefore pleased him in a part of his mind that had grown up before he learned to love symmetry. Vorst walked beside Oden without touching him, giving that restraint the weight of a treaty. The rune priest tapped his staff on every 3rd flagstone, and the stones remembered they were supposed to be there. The maze didn't push. It suggested. A piece of floor became a page and tried to be read. An alcove breathed as if holding a question in its throat and promised an answer if you leaned in. Ropes of prayer flags drooped with the heavy damp of other people's oaths. They refused to lean. They refused to read. They carried their own oaths. A boy ran out of a side hall that had not been there a heartbeat before and attached himself to Scory's greave, eyes the color of a winter sky that hasn't made up its mind about snow. "Papa," he said in Fenrisian too perfectly. The rune priest looked without blinking. Scory went very still, then crouched and set a gloved hand gentle as a thumbnail on the false child's head. "I buried my sons by the ice," he said softly. "We do not dig twice." The boy's face folded into origami and then into nothing, and the corridor found itself ashamed enough to straighten a little. Vorst's voice did not rise, but the woman inside it felt the tremor. "It will try subtler next." It did. A turn opened onto a chapel whose cracked frescoes had mended themselves with sentimental haste. A priest in threadbare white bent over a woman's hand and the skin healed under his whisper, leaving a scar shaped like gratitude. The priest turned his head and it was Vorst's own mentor, dead a decade and 2 inquisitions, eyes heavy with the kind of love that gives dangerous permission. "Child," he said, and the word was a key left under the mat. "Do the work without the cost. It's time we spared ourselves." Vorst took one step in and stopped herself as if she had found the edge of a cliff by memory. She did not answer the illusion. She answered Oden, speaking as if she were reading a brief into stone. "If this place offers me efficiency, it will bill me for truth." The chapel held its breath like a liar waiting to be told it is believed. Oden tilted his head at the priest with the terrible kindness of someone who can afford to be gentle with ghosts. The walls remembered how to be walls again. Hecateer laughed once, short enough to be a cough, when a perfect equation wrote itself across the curve of reality over his head in light. It promised a mechanism for souls. It promised a switch inside the idea of death you could flip to restart. It promised the machine god understood him the way he hoped his friends did. He did not reach for it. He practiced not reaching for it with everything he had. The rune knots at the corners warmed under his touch as if proud of him. The maze, bored with failing nicely, grew teeth. The ceiling pressed down with the insistence of a questioner who has learned to smile. The air turned thin as a lie stretched too far. They came to a circular hall whose doors were all the same door and none of them the one they needed. In the center, a font bubbled, not water, not ink. Memory ground fine. The surface reflected futures that felt true because they were flattering. Victories without casualties, obedience without fear, rightness without ambiguity. Oden stood at its lip and the font stilled, as if an older gravity had reminded it of manners. He looked into it and saw a road he could walk with no one dying, a road where the emperor on his throne turned his head and spoke aloud and no one paid for that miracle with their last best thing. He could take that road. He could, perhaps, take it for a while. He unlaced the leather that held the patch at his temple and set it aside. The socket there was not empty. It was full of a darkness that had learned kindness by being asked to hold it for too long. "I have paid once," he said, and the words made the font's surface tremble, "and found the cost fair." He dipped 2 fingers into the memory and brought them to his brow, smearing the unseen with the seen. The air shivered. The hall's doors flickered like eyelids trying not to cry. "Again," he said, and it was not performance, not sorrow, only a craftsman accepting the price of a tool. He pressed his thumb into his own skin and the room brightened, not with light but with consequence. Something left him. Not sight, not exactly. Later, he would try to recall a name and find only the warmth of it where the letters should sit. He would smile and let the ache be part of the map. Now, a thin thread strung itself from the font to a particular door at the hall's edge. No larger than the others, a little scuffed where many hands had loved it. He pointed, and the group moved. The rune priest glanced at him and saw the absence and looked away, counting that kind of bravery among the things you do not touch unless asked. They filed into a stair whose steps were too shallow until they were suddenly too steep. Scory took point, back heavy with a pack full of spare magazines and one ridiculous bottle he refused to abandon. The sisters rose and dipped like a single flame. The Scutarii's feet hit each riser in the same pattern, refusing to be seduced into tripping by the way the edges wavered. Vorst did not offer Oden an arm and did not deny herself the right to catch him if he reached. He did not. At the landing stood a figure in robes the color of oil on water. It wore the face of a scholar and the hands of a strangler. Its smile was patient and wrong. "Wanderer," it said in a voice that remembered being more voices stitched together, Your talent for dullness is a kind of theft. The changer offers you a library of ladders and you insist on a single step. Trade with me. Give me that hammer and I will give you a question with no answer that will keep you company through every century. Oden looked past it, which was cruelty and mercy at once. No, he said. I have too many of those already. Scory lifted his weapon but held his fire. The thing in robes made as if to clap. The sleeves lifted and the hands beneath them were not hands but quills, and where they pointed the air wrote itself into traps. The sisters answered with bolter fire punctuated by prayers that had learned how to punch. The rune priest drew a circle in soot with the end of his staff and the quills skittered around it like etiquette. It was not a battle so much as a negotiation with malice. The robe thing tried to be a law. Oden's refusal wrote it into a suggestion. When it lunged, and it did because even cleverness gets impatient, it met Mjolnir sideways, as if the hammer had decided to be a doorframe. The impact unraveled sentences in the thing's bones and it collapsed into a pile of punctuation that fluttered and lay still. Hecateer scooped a comma into a specimen tin and blushed when Vorst arched one eyebrow at him. For study, he muttered. If it continues to be a comma in the box, we win. They came out into a square that had been round when they were not looking. Pilgrims huddled in its lee, eyes glassy with equations they had never learned. A sister knelt and cupped a woman's cheek, thumb stroking the place where numbers had begun to replace freckles. The woman's breath steadied. The number faded as if embarrassed to be seen. Oden passed among them without benediction, touching the lintels of two doors, a child's wooden charm in a pocket, the hinge of a gate. Things that had started to lie about themselves remembered a better story and blushed back into truth. We are close, the rune priest said. He didn't mean to the heart of the maze. He meant to the moment people start mistaking exhaustion for inevitability. Scory tossed him a grin like a bone to a friendly dog. Then we get closer. They pushed on. The maze, denied its favorite forms of play, showed its temper. Colors sharpened to edges. Shadows held too many coins of movement. They entered a hall of mirrors without glass, reflections built from incident and inference. Each person saw a version of themselves get the thing they wanted most and survive it. A sister with hands like iron held a baby that cooed and did not break. Her mouth opened, closed, became a prayer that hurt more than marching. Hecateer saw a universe that could be engineered into kindness. Vorst saw a court where every order she gave saved both lives and souls. Scory saw his Primarch lift a tankard across a long table and laugh, and the laugh shook dust from stars. Oden stood among all these small mercies and felt the oldest temptation. Not to power, but to neatness. To the long lie of a world in which the ledger can be balanced. He closed his eye and listened instead for the rough sound of people walking forward on feet that hurt. It came. He raised the hammer a hand's breadth. The reflections thinned as if embarrassed to be caught being gentle with the wrong things. They walked on and left their better selves behind with a tenderness that was fiercer than refusal. At last, the maze brought them to a door not grand, not guarded by a riddle or a roar. It was a plain parish door, its paint scratched by years of faithful hands, its latch polished by worry. From beyond it came voices speaking doctrine the way men speak their lovers' names when they are trying to decide whether to leave. Oden put his palm on the wood and felt the heat of an argument that had lasted too long. They stepped into a chamber of texts and blood. Ecclesiarchs and priests had barricaded themselves behind a geometry made out of their own robes and fear. Their eyes had the glassy sheen of minds turning into calipers. Script crawled up their wrists like ivy, rooting in veins, making proclamations that chased each other around the skin. They raised croziers and accusations in the same motion when they saw Oden. Heresy, one intoned, but the word came out as a fraction. Vorst took a step forward, rosette hard as a thrown coin. Lower your weapons, she said to men who outranked almost everyone and themselves obeyed a ghost nailed to a chair. Your liturgies are compromised. You will be purified and returned to function. If you purify them by fire, you feed the thing that made them clever, the rune priest warned. His staff made a small, necessary sound against the floor. The priests flinched at it as if it had named them. Oden looked at the nearest of them, a scholar priest whose mouth had become a little door for numbers. He did not say heretic. He did not say brother. He said the man's given name perfectly, and the script along the priest's jaw stuttered like a machine, remembering it also had a heart. "I can't stop the change by beating it," Oden said quietly into a room trained to hear only certainties. "But I can give your faith a place to stand while it forgets what it was trying to turn into." He stepped closer, slow enough to be refused, hammer low. Behind the barricade, a crozier flared with sorceress light dressed as zeal. The room went very bright and very still, as if the maze itself had leaned close with glee to watch a doctrine break. The priest's lips began to move in approof. Oden lifted 2 fingers and drew, in the air, the smallest shape he knew that could hold a man together. Not a rune, not a spell, the outline of a door you draw for a child so they remember which way home feels like. He placed it around the priest's throat like a collar made of breath. On the far side of the chamber, something with too many eyes rolled them all at once in exasperated affection for its own malice. The air hissed as if about to become fire and thought better of it. The first voice that wasn't a number said, "Horse. I remember the hymn." Another answered, weeping with embarrassment, "I hated that hymn," and a sister laughed wetly because the sound of honest, petty dislike is better warding than any prayer against a god of grand designs. Vorst did not lower her hand. She did not raise it higher. The moment hung. The maze, robbed of spectacle, shifted its weight and looked for a new game. Outside the chamber, down in streets still learning to recognize themselves, pilgrims began to drift in the right directions for reasons they would later ascribe to luck. Above, in the cathedral, the choir added a plain note to their hymn, and that plainness irritated something bright blue and clever enough to count as an injury. Oden breathed once like a man about to step onto ice he knows will hold. "One at a time," he said, to Vorst, to the sisters, to the wolves, to the priests who were starting to sweat words back into sentences. "No fights we don't have to win. No miracles we don't have to owe. Walk close." They worked the room until it remembered it was a chapel and not a trap. The worst of the script leached from the priest's skin as if shame had learned to wash. Words turned back into breath. A crozier clattered from a cramped hand and rang like something dropped in a kitchen instead of a battlefield, and that ordinary music let everyone unclench a fraction. One elder, jaw mottled with figures that didn't want to depart, fixed on Oden with a fury steadier than the numbers. "You are a masquerade," he rasped. "A warp thing in a borrowed myth. If we kneel to you, we betray the throne." Oden did not step closer. He made the room smaller by being gentle inside it. "Then do not kneel," he said. "Keep your back straight and your eyes open. The emperor has enough worship. He needs honesty." "Blasphemy is a kind of honesty," the elder shot back, and a ghost of a fraction crawled across his lip again, hunting for purchase. "Then let's try a different kind," Oden said, and opened his empty hand so the priest could see there was no compulsion, only an offer. "Hold a truth with me and see if it breaks." Vorst's gaze flicked between them, measuring outcomes that had no precedent. Scori leaned his shoulder to a pillar that had decided to be a pillar again and let his grin go slack, which in him was a form of respect. The rune priest kept his staff on the floor, steadying the cutwater of the room's mood. Hecadir, who had never met a paradox he didn't want to adopt and raise as his own, inched nearer. The elder put his palm to Oden's, shaking, and the maze gathered like a cat to watch a glass teeter. Oden spoke low, so the words had to be carried, not thrown. "If I am false, your faith will be enough." He looked not at the elder but at the thing crouching in the angles, the cleverness that had turned sermons into puzzles. "If I am true, your faith will still be enough. Either way, you keep it. I do not take it." The fraction along the elder's jawline faltered, divided itself, discovered it had no dividend worth the name, and smeared into sweat. He swayed, caught himself, and barked a brief laugh of surprise that turned, despite him, into a sob. The other priests watched not a miracle but a refusal to need one and found it tolerable. The barricade came down in pieces, not as surrender but as choice. Outside, bells rang a schedule that had never been written. Evacuation sectors opening and closing as streets agreed to be streets. Sisters moved along the routes with a precision that loved lives more than plans. Scutarii posted their chalk knots at corners that thought too highly of themselves. When a pilgrim line paused to weep at a shrine because the habit of weeping is often the only bridge to motion, No one hurried them. The weeping finished its work faster because it wasn't embarrassed. In a side transept, a delegation waited in red and brass and smoke. The Mechanicus had built a temple out of measurement and then brought it to the meeting. Muggos Hecateer stood ahead of them, lenses bright, a little ashamed of how proud he was to be first. He bowed to Vorst, to the Canoness, to Scori, in the rigid order that spared feelings by refusing to consider them. Then he turned to Oden with a reverence that refused to be worship. "Entity Oden," he began, then corrected himself without fuss. "Wanderer. Your presence modulates machine spirits in a way that increases compliance without reducing dignity. This is in violation of our categories in the best possible way. The fabricator demands a benediction of compliance to codify the phenomenon or, failing that, a schema we can ritualize without you." The senior tech priest behind him clicked, a sound like beads counted by claws. "Submit to 9 scans," the old voice said, "and surrender 1 relic for disassembly." The servo-skulls around him smelted the air into incense. Oden looked at the rails of red robes, at cables that trembled like veins that had forgotten how to be shy. He kept his voice soft. "If I give you an answer, you will put it in a jar and it will die of neatness. I will give you a question that keeps working instead." He crouched and drew on the flagstone with a bit of charcoal from a burnt hymn book. It wasn't a rune in the sense the Mechanicus could catalog. It was a loop that measured itself, a coil that refused to settle until a living mind paid attention without trying to own. "Pray this while checking tolerances," he said, and Hecateer could hear the smile tucked in the instruction. "If the numbers get easier, you are bullying your machine. If they get harder, you are abandoning it to its loneliness. If they stay stubborn and you find you don't mind, you have found cooperation." Hecateer's breath hitched at the elegance. The senior tech priest made a small disgusted noise that had the decency to also be intrigued. "This is non-determinism packaged as piety," the old voice muttered. "This is respect disguised as work," Oden said. "Your kind loves both." The Muggos copied the loop with careful irreverence, muttering, "A paradox that refuses to sit down," and his slate shivered with pleasure at the thought. He bowed again, and the bow this time was to the idea, not the man. Behind him, a few red robes tilted their heads as if a hinge had just learned better oil. The city sulked, then struck. A fresco tore itself from the wall and became a procession of painted saints that showed teeth too white for paint. They stepped with the weight of metaphors that had gone to seed. Bolters barked, but the rounds bent into scrollwork and pinned themselves prettily to the floor. The procession opened its painted mouths and sang a sanctus that spelled out someone else's name between the lines. "Song then," Oden said, and gave the pitch, not the melody. The choir, scattered now through the cathedral like seed in furrows, caught it. A plain chant rose, the kind too simple to twist without breaking. The painted sanctus tried to braid itself into the simplicity and got bored because there were no knots to be proud of. The saints' jaws closed, ashamed of overreach. Their paint ran backward into plaster. The wall dried with a grateful sigh. "Not yet," the rune priest said. "Something smaller that thinks it's big because it has a good hat." Before they crossed, a procession rounded the far corner. Sisters bearing reliquaries on poles, faces covered in veils stitched with prayers. Their step was measured, their chant almost right. Vorst lifted a hand, and her retinue shifted. Not weapons up, not weapons down, but ready to make either choice without apology. The lead sister paused, head tilted with theatrical humility. "We will take the relics to the heart," she said, voice muffled and wrong by the thickness of certainty. "We will trade them for a better city." "Relics don't bargain," the canoness said. "They witness." Oden stepped into their path without menace. "Let me see your burden." The veils turned as one, and for a second too long a set of painted eyes blinked from behind the cloth. The rune priest's staff hit the floor like a gavel. Scori's shot took the left bearer's pole at the bracket, dropping a reliquary with a clatter that sounded very much like cheap tin. The fake sisters rippled, their veils sloughing into streamers of script that tried to lasso ankles. The canoness's blade, blessed by repetition more than right, cut the loops the way truth cuts a rumor. Not cleanly, but effectively. The knot procession recoiled, offended at being obvious, and bled back into an alcove that hadn't been there a breath before. Through, Vorst said, and nobody argued with the pleasure in her discipline. Beyond the breathing arch, the maze thinned to a single hall lined with confessionals. Their doors stood open. On every bench sat a version of someone they loved, waiting to be forgiven for the wrong thing. Scory paused at a boy's broad back and kept walking. The rune priest brushed the shoulder of a woman who had once taught him to read the sky and let the ache be a map, not a trap. Vorst's mentor looked up from one of the booths, ready to absolve her of weariness, which is the most expensive absolution. She did not go in. Oden passed the booths like a man walking through a garden he would not steal from. Each illusion turned its head toward him and then turned away, embarrassed to have been caught trying to help in the wrong direction. The hall opened into a chamber that had taken the cathedral's geometry and folded it neatly. At its center, a pit rotated like an argument with good manners. Within the slow wheel, a figure stood on nothing, the clerk of this labyrinth, robed in parchment, crowned with a dossier of stolen intentions. Its hands were quills that wrote the paths men would take while congratulating them for choosing freely. It inclined its head toward Oden. "All-Father," it said, "would you like me to edit your saga for today? I can remove the parts that cost." Oden answered it with the courtesy of a craftsman to another craftsman mucking about with a tool they hadn't earned. "I would like you to get bored," he said, and stepped onto the air of the pit as if it were a floor. The wheel tried to make him a statistic and met a refusal that did not escalate, only endured. He raised the hammer a little, not to strike, but to establish gravity. The clerk wrote faster. Paths curled like handwriting losing patience. The sister's boots skidded. The Scutarii's chalk knots lifted from the floor with little noises of betrayal. Hecateer, teeth bared in something like joy, threw the paradox loop into the air like a lasso and caught a swath of moving stairs, pinning them to honest friction. The rune priest spat a word in Fenrisian that could have been a prayer or a threat, and both worked. Vorst broke the deadlock the way she did everything, by selecting a cost and paying it. "The West Quarter," she said into the Vox, voice flint and frost. "Collapse the arcade. Force a path to the pilgrim fields. Displace 3 shrines to save 10,000. The canoness's jaw clenched, then set. "So declared," she replied, and gave the orders with a steadiness that did not hide that she loved the shrines. Somewhere below, stone learned to fall in the right order. The city bucked with pain and then yielded. The wheel in the chamber stuttered. The clerk faltered, quills scratching blankly for a second. Oden took that heartbeat and spent it. He looked into futures that smelled of cold iron and wet wool and the taste of endings. He let one more memory slide out of his reach and did not flinch. "There," he said, pointing not at a door but at an angle. "We go there, and we go now, or the next 10 minutes become years." They went. The wheel spun itself into dizziness trying to predict a route that owed it nothing. The clerk reached for Oden with a hand full of punctuation and got the hammer's haft laid across its knuckles like a patient teacher's warning. It hissed and became a column of footnotes and slunk into the ceiling, where liars go when they need to rethink. They burst into light. Plain light, honest as a morning after a storm. The labyrinth's cleverness thinned, resentful the way a talented bully gets when jokes stop landing. Below them, through a lattice of broken vaulting, the pilgrim fields widened like lungs finally allowed to fill. Lines of people moved where lines of people should move. The choir's hymn came steady now, not triumphant, just stubborn, and the stubbornness made it beautiful. A shadow crossed that light and left a cold that wasn't weather. Not a clerk now. Not a hat. Something vast, curious, and amused uncoiled just out of sight, as if a question had grown wings and a long appetite. Feathers big enough to be metaphors brushed the outer air, and the city's stones sighed because they knew what that meant even if the people didn't yet. Scory's grin came back like a knife being politely set on a table. "At last," he said, almost cheerful. "Something big enough to punch without hurting its feelings." Vorst didn't look away from the sky that wasn't sky anymore. "Hold the line," she said, more to herself than to them, as if turning the words into a plank she could walk out on. "Hold the people. Hold the hymn." Oden lifted Mjolnir and felt the weight of 1,000 small mercies settle along the haft like hands. He looked at the faces around him, wolves with laughter in their bones, women who carried fire like water, machine priests bewildered and brave, an inquisitor whose certainty had learned to share, and nodded once, very slightly, as if acknowledging an oath he had not asked for and would keep anyway. Close, he said for the third time, and the word sounded like a road deciding it would not wander. We walk close. The light dimmed as a shadow stepped down out of its own thought, and a voice like pages turning in a wind no one had ordered asked, with terrible courtesy, whether anyone here had ever considered being interesting. The thing that stepped down out of its own idea wore the shape of a bird because it enjoyed the joke, not because it needed wings. Feathers slid through hues that didn't have names yet and wouldn't keep them long if they did. Its eyes were libraries burning slowly. It rested a staff across talons that had written 1,000 destinies in ash and then pretended surprise at the endings. When it spoke, the air smelled like blue chalk and old ink. You have made my city dull, it said, and every syllable contained 3 better versions of itself. I am wounded. Scory grinned with honest malice. Good. We aim to offend. Vorst took 1 step forward, as if addressing a witness who could destroy the record by speaking. You have violated a shrine world. Stand down or be unmade. Stand down, the Lord of Change purred, tasting the phrase like a new wine, as if the world were a bench and not a suggestion. I do not stand. I revise. It tilted its head. And I am not here for you, brittle law. I am here for the old man who insists on paying. Oden lifted Mjolnir, and every little mercy they'd earned that day settled along the haft like small hands. I don't pay you, he said. I pay the story. The demon laughed, a sound like a stack of paper falling forever. I am the story. No, Oden said, soft as frost. You are the hunger for endings that flatter you. It moved first because change cannot help itself. The staff traced a circle and the sky fell through it. Stairs to nowhere tumbled from the hole and tried to lead men to deaths that would look like choices. The sisters' stances shifted as one. Their litanies thudded into a plain, unlovely rhythm that allowed no place to hide ornament. The stairs turned sheepish, then stone, then rubble that made decent cover. Skitarii chalk knots crawled from their satchels like clever spiders and pinned corners to the floor. Hecateer threw his loop of cooperation into the machinery of the vault, and every cog there discovered it worked better when watched with patience instead of lust. The Lord of Change reached with a hand made of questions and found Scory already inside its guard, laughing too loudly and not at the jokes it preferred. The demon flicked a claw. The space wolf's bones almost decided to be equations. Oden's hammer kissed the air, and the formulas forgot their pride and lay down as sums again. Scory rolled, came up swearing devoutly, and fired a burst that forced the demon to blink 3 of its future eyes. You can write fate in prettier ink, he shouted, but it still smears when it sweats. Below, the canoness moved lines of pilgrims through streets that had tired of lying. She traded shrines for lives without flinching and hated that each trade made her better at it. Column 3 left. No, left the way your grandmother meant it, she corrected, and an entire block obeyed a memory it hadn't known it owned. The choir's hymn held at a stubborn pitch that bored the cleverness out of the air like a lathe. The demon angled a wing and 100 copies unfolded, each with a different clever flaw. Some were too beautiful. Some were just wrong enough to hook the eye. Oden ignored them with the cruelty of a craftsman who refuses to praise a trick. He walked toward the one future that would take a blow and keep its consequence. Come down, he told it, from your perch of possibilities. It obliged because vanity is a leash. The staff swept. He caught it on the hammer shaft, and the impact scattered constellations across the inside of everyone's teeth. The Lord tried to change the name of gravity. The hammer reminded the floor of being floor. The demon offered him a trade mid-strike, voice quick with charm. Give me the memory you just spent in the maze, and I will return it with interest, old god. Your lost name, your lost road, your lost son's laugh. Mjolnir struck a half-beat late, the way a storyteller saves the best line until the breath after you think the tale is done. The demon reeled. I remember him without remembering, Oden said, and it hurt in a true way, and the hurt made a path steadier than any bargain. The rune priest sang low, not to the demon, but to the stones, apologizing for making them hold so much weight. The stones liked being asked. They bore. The labyrinth tried to write a clever trap around that courtesy and discovered it had bored itself halfway through the second sentence and wandered off. Vorst chose another cost. Collapse the north transept, she ordered into the vox, voice steady as a table. Save the infirmary. We lose the reliquary of the martyr of 9. We keep the living. Somewhere below, faith fell the way masonry does when it understands triage. A scream of torn geometry told them they'd pulled a tooth that had loved its place too much. The pilgrim lines moved faster. The sky split, not with the warp's cancerous stink, but with a disciplined wound. Blue thunderheads in brazen plate punched through cloud, and a spear of ultramarine fire wrote law across air. A gunship's ramp crashed down, and a giant in laurels strode into the breach with a sword that remembered empires. His presence forced the world into margins neat enough to count. He spared the battlefield one measuring glance and then, perfectly, chose humility. Where do you require me? Robot Gilliman asked Vorst, as if she were the only other person in the room who understood that duty is a form of courtesy. Hold the west promenade, she answered without bowing. Keep it a line. He turned, already moving, and his warriors moved with him like a diagram learning to breathe. The maze tried to be impressed by itself and found it had run out of compliments. The Lord of Change recovered with the insulted elegance of a dancer tripping and pretending it had meant to. It flung its wings wide and all the doors of the city opened inward. Choices poured out, easy absolutions, glamorous martyrdoms, victories with receipts already paid. People staggered. The canoness closed her eyes, breathed, and began to call names, not ranks. Mara, Keth, Brother Sergeant Leo, Hecateer, Sister Agnet, Vorst. Each named person remembered their childhood or their first oath or the face they'd loved before they learned to love the work, and in that small remembering the big offers looked gaudy and wrong. Doors drifted shut. Oden and the demon circled. It tried jokes, prophecies, arithmetic. He offered boredom, patience, the repeated movements that make craft and kill spectacle. Every time the staff flashed, his hammer answered with the same simple notes. Feathers sparked into equations and fell as ash. The duel looked slow if you didn't understand that slowness was the point, that every avoided flourish was a refusal to feed the appetite that had made the city interesting enough to break. Be interesting, the Lord hissed finally, frustrated into honesty. Make a mistake. Surprise me. No, Oden said, and drove Mjolnir through the staff just below the head. The wood, or whatever had been pretending to be wood, split with a scream like a theorem disproved in public. Shock rippled back along the demon's arms. Its feathers flashed through ages and found none to settle in. It came apart in books falling open too fast. Rage made it smaller, as rage often does. It shed grandeur, dropped cunning, became a knot of spite and raw invention, and lunged. Scory met it with a roar that had eaten snow and grief and come up stronger. The demon raked. The space wolf took the lines on his armor and wore them like new laughter. Sisters hammered prayer into flesh and ceramic. Hecateer chanted his paradox with the fervor of a man who had found a religion that refused to be comfortable. Gilliman's line did not bend. It did not become a curve with excuses. It was a line because he said so and because 1,000 men around him agreed to be geometry for an hour. The Lord of Change tried one last trick, the oldest. It asked for pity. It gathered itself into a small, clever thing with 2 bright eyes and held out its broken staff like a hurt bird holds out a wing. Mercy, then, it whispered. Forgiveness for style. You may leave, Oden said, and the mercy was genuine. And you may take your questions with you. They are not bad questions. They are only dishonestly asked. It shrank its feathers one by one, each dropping an epigram as it went. It rose, smirking, already scripting the tale it would tell in some other corner of the dark. As it lifted, it looked back once, all amusement again. Your bridge phrase, it said, almost tender. If you keep mending strangers' roads, wanderer, you will run out of home. Oden watched it go. The labyrinth's angles sagged like a mind tired of being clever. Streets straightened in embarrassment. Bells remembered their hours. The air stopped tasting like a schoolroom. He lowered the hammer and every small hand slid off the haft. Not gone, only returned to the people they belonged to. He turned to the work that always follows victory and counts as part of it. Lifting beams, setting splints, answering questions with a nod instead of an oath. Vorst stood beside him and did not ask if he had heard the barb about the bridge. She could see it on his face and chose, for once, to leave an answer unharvested. "The West Promenade holds," she reported instead, as if good reports could be stitched into a cloak warm enough for the next walk. Casualties below projection. The choir kept singing. "They will be hoarse tomorrow," he said, and that ordinary complaint made her smile too quickly and stop herself too late. Hecatier approached with hands blackened by soot and equations. "The loop works," he said, boyish with delight he had not enjoyed for years. "It resists standardization. I hate it. I'm in love." The canoness arrived last, as commanders often do, having seen everyone else eat before she allowed herself water. She looked up at the cathedral's ragged vault, at the sky beyond, where clouds were just clouds again. "The sanctum stands. The relics we lost were only boxes. The ones we kept are the promises that remain when no one is watching." She inclined her head an inch, which in her was a bow. "Thank you for helping me choose the right losses." Gilliman returned, armor scored with work, eyes bright with calculus. He measured Oden openly, then, to his credit, measured himself in the same glance. "You're not his kind," he said, meaning the Emperor, meaning gods. "But you are a kind of father." "Only when I remember," Oden said. He looked toward the horizon where the Bifrost used to be and saw nothing with his eye and too much with the absence behind it. A thread in the dark tugged, frayed, questioning whether it still had two ends. The Lord's parting grace had been truth wrapped in malice. "We seal what remains of the rift," Vorst said. "Efficient again because efficiency is a bomb she knows how to use. We'll leave garrisons. We'll catalog the heresies and the miracles and discover they are the same things told by different witnesses." "You," she hesitated, picked the less comfortable word. "Go." He nodded, and the nod included all of them. The woman whose orders had saved more than doctrine, the wolf whose laughter had strapped men to courage, the priest who had chosen questions that made machines kinder, the giant who held lines because someone must, the choir who had been brave without audience. He turned once in a slow circle, making sure the city saw him seeing it, because places remember that kind of courtesy. The ravens came from nowhere like thoughts returning. One settled on his shoulder and pecked his ear with practiced tenderness. The other took the sky's measure and found it acceptable. Oden lifted the hammer and, just this once, let it ring. The sound climbed the spire, crossed the fields, and went out into the dark, a simple note that did not try to be interesting, only true. Far away, under a mountain of machines, a bell answered from a sea no ship would dare. It was not consent. It was recognition. He closed his eye and found the road that would take him to that cold fire. "Walk close," he said one more time, though the battle was done and the way ahead would be mostly quiet and mostly not. Stories get lost when they try to walk alone. He stepped toward the place where the Bifrost used to be, and the air made room for him, grudging and respectful, the way hard roads do when a traveler has earned the right to go on. The world took a long, ordinary breath. Rubble became work instead of tragedy. The choir slept in shifts with their mouths open like spent bellows. The canoness drew up rosters in the ash with the point of her blade, and every name she wrote stayed a name and did not turn into a number. Scutarii peeled their chalk knots from the floors and pressed them into the hands of children as toys, because sometimes you teach a city to behave by giving its future something to fidget with. Gilliman's line unstrung itself with the same precision it had been strung, filing away a victory as if it were a tool returned to a clean peg. Vorst wrote, then stopped writing, then wrote again, the quill a metronome that kept her from thinking too loudly. Oden stood in the sanctum with his palm on the old wood of the Vox altar. The hum there had settled into a human pitch, one that could be kept by tired throats. The Bifrost's taste, metal, snow, the first clean sip after a long march, lingered in his mouth like a word you don't have to speak to know. The frayed edge of it tugged at him from the dark, and he could feel where clever fingers had plucked at the weave. He set Mjolnir on the floor as a man sets a cup down to go and wash his hands. Vorst came and stood with him in the half-light. She did not ask for permission, and he did not grant it. If you go, she said, the cadence of a report wrapped tight around the ribs of a confession. I cannot justify following. I also cannot justify letting you walk into the warp's throat alone. You can do both, he said, and the kindness in it made it bearable. Stand where your duty is and trust that mine knows its own boots. Give me sanction and keep it on the paper. She worked her jaw once. Then she did something that would not make it into any of her accounts. She took off her rosette and pressed it to the wood beside his hand, just hard enough to leave a circle of warmth. Sanction, she said. Returns expected. Returns accepted if they're the wrong kind. He touched 2 fingers to the mark. Witnessed. Scory found them there, a new scar across his cheek that would look better on him every winter. He clapped Oden once on the shoulder, not hard, but like a promise exchanged without words. I'll keep the wolves loud, he said. You keep the sky honest. Trade you, Oden said, and held out the cask Scory had rescued through every turn of the maze, now with a knot carved into its lid in a hand too old to be neat. When you drink this, tell the storm a joke first. Scory grinned like a man who has been told a secret about a thing he already loved. Hecateer stood hovering with a slate hugged like a book. He had the look of a man about to ask for an autograph from a theorem. The loop, he said, almost breathless with loyalty to the idea that had refused to sit still for him. May I teach it? Properly. Codify the imprecision so it can travel without you. Teach it like a dance, Oden said. There is a step you only learn by doing it wrong once and laughing. I can standardize that, Hecateer blurted and then caught himself and then laughed properly. No. I can't. Good. The rune priest leaned his staff in the doorway and watched without speaking, snow somewhere under his tongue. Oden slid him a look that belonged to hills at dusk. When the sea ice is strange, lay your ear on it, he said. Don't guess. Listen. The priest inclined his head. We will try to be dull when brightness would flatter us. The canoness arrived last, crossing herself with her gauntlet hand and a piece of grit she would keep in a pocket for a year without sentimentalizing it even once. We are steady, she said. For now. Steady is a verb, Oden said. It suits you. The ravens came as if they'd always been part of the sanctum, settling on a beam blackened by 1,000 years of breath. One cocked its head at Vorst's mark and pecked it once, gently, as if to put a period after it. Oden lifted the hammer. The altar thrummed. The air folded and went very quiet, the way a room does when a door opens to whether it respects. He stepped onto a road that wasn't a road, just a memory of one insisted into happening. The city stayed behind him like a held breath. He took 3 steps and the noise of the world narrowed to the sound a needle makes when it finds cloth again. The walls were not walls. They were choices that had been made and kept. The dark was not dark. It was the absence of decoration. The Bifrost, in that place where even metaphors must pay for their seats, was a single thread of light pulled tight. He walked. Something clever paced him at the edge of meaning, not daring to show itself as itself so soon after getting bored to death in front of an audience. It offered him shortcuts in the shape of old loves and older regrets. He refused with the patience of a man who had stood on one leg for 9 days to learn one true thing. After a while, it got tired of not being admired and slunk off to a fresher city. The bridge frayed in 2 places. He stopped at the first and took stock. What he had to give that might stitch this kind of tear was not fire or thunder. Those had been spent and earned back 100 times. What he had was a small, uninteresting name he had kept since a winter no one remembered. He let go of it. The thread tightened. At the second tear he set down a promise he had never told anyone because it had been made only to himself. The road drank it the way dry wood drinks oil, and the sheen along the span became quiet and strong. When he reached the far side he was not on Terra and he was not somewhere else. He stood at the lip of a room that is not a room, a kiln inside a mountain made of wires and prayer. There was a chair so large the word throne felt like flattery. There was a man who was not a man anymore, not in any of the small, dear ways that make a life. He had paid those pieces into the engine that needed them. Heat came off him without warmth. Light came out of him without brightness. Duty came from him like tides. For a space that might have been a second or might have been the absence of counting, the two of them were simply men who had built bridges of different kinds and suffered the tax of keeping them open. Oden did not kneel. The Emperor did not rise. Each refused to make the other carry a gesture he hadn't chosen. Oden could have said 100 things the way one says thank you with words too big for the mouth. He said none of them. He lifted his hammer a finger's breadth. I see you. I do not add to what you hold. I will take what pieces stumble to me on the road, and I will not bring them back to your door unless you call. A bell somewhere, struck under miles of salt water, answered. It was not blessing. It was recognition. The sound placed his heart down exactly where it needed to be to keep beating without apology. He turned to go, and found Gilliman standing at the last sensible angle a reality permits when it wants two men to meet without ceremony. He had not followed. He had been there the way responsibility is always there in the places where burdens cross. He took in the hammer, the thread of light stitched behind it, the man exhausted enough to be honest without effort. Stay, Gilliman said, and it wasn't an order. Let us name you. Let us put you on a ledger and draw lines from you to safety. You already have a father, Oden said. He kept his voice low so it wouldn't carry like a promise. He cannot walk. I cannot sit. If I stay, I will insult the shape of the sacrifice you are built upon. If I go, I may keep you company from the edges without asking your people to betray their own names for me. Exile then. Gilliman's mouth tilted, not quite a smile. You choose the cold. I choose the road, Oden said, and felt the relief in telling the truth so plainly. I have been bound. I have been king. Neither taught me as much as walking and not being sure how many meals are left in the sack. Gilliman's chin dipped once, the exact angle a man uses to accept a cost and keep accounts clean. Then hear this, he said. Where your steps intersect ours, we will not make of you a saint. We will list your acts as anomalies and let them gather into a pattern in the hearts of people who need patterns. If you ever ask us, we will come. If we ever ask you, come if you can. I'll come if the story needs a witness, Oden said. Sometimes that's all. They parted without turning their backs, not from suspicion, but from a courtesy earned on too many battlefields where the sky was loud and the ground was thin. He returned along the stitched bridge. The sanctum met him with the sigh of a room that has discovered it will still be a room tomorrow. Vorst had not moved the rosette's heat mark. She had inked a circle around it and written no notes. The canoness had slept sitting up and woke without dramatics when the air changed. Hecatier had fallen asleep on his slate and the loop had drawn itself around his cheek in charcoal. Scory had already begun telling a version of the day he knew he'd improve with each retelling but never lie about. Oden gave back what small things could be returned. To the canoness, a plain note hummed from the hammer's head, one she could teach to novices without risking their souls to ornament. To Hecatier, a rhythm to count with when the numbers wanted to be loved too much. To the rune priest, a wind to remember when the ice speaks. To Scory, a promise that when he howled at the right piece of sky, birds would come and bother his enemies in exactly the right annoying way. To Vorst, nothing she could put in a report, a quiet nod that let a small ache unclench somewhere under the armor where no one but her would ever feel it. He walked the streets one last time as they lay back into themselves. He touched a lintel and a gate hinge and a child's toy and a pilgrim's sleeve and made no miracles anybody would build a church over. He made eye contact with a tired woman carrying 2 bowls of soup and made sure that he saw her not spill. When he reached the highest parapet on the cathedral spire, he turned to look the way travelers do when they understand they are going and that going is not leaving but a different kind of staying. Gilliman was a blue line at the city's edge, already a dozen decisions ahead. Vorst was a black candle at the sanctum, burning without asking for praise. The canoness was a hinge between crowds and order. The wolves were laughter in armor, headed toward the next trouble like men late to a dance. The ravens preened as if nothing interesting had happened, and would not unless someone made the mistake of asking them about it. Mjolnir rang once, low and satisfying, the sound a hammer makes when it tells metal the work is over for the day. A thread lifted from the air, cautious and proud, and stretched toward a place that was not a place yet but would be when his boot came down on it. The bridge wasn't a rainbow now. It was thinner, a seam, a seamstress's stitch that only the tailor sees. That was better. Let the sky be a working garment nobody notices until it tears. He stepped onto it and the wind moved to make space. Behind him, in 100 corners of the Imperium that did not know one another, small things began to happen that would never be recorded properly. A machine psalm picked up a human breath between its lines and worked better for it, and no one wrote why. A sister sang the plain note under a showy hymn and a congregation cried because relief is a kind of holiness. A Muggos in a forge on a moon far from anybody's center told his apprentices a story about cooperation as if it were a measurement and watched them try keeping their hands gentle without being told to. A boy on Fenris heard the ice complain under his spear and stepped back because a voice in a story had once told him to listen first. An inquisitor signed a writ with a line through the part that would have burned the wrong people. A giant in blue armor let his men tell a badly timed joke and did not correct it. On a dead world a long way off, a pilgrim found a stain of color in the sky no one else could see and whispered, to no one he could name, that he was not alone. In the great palace where the mountain of machines breathed its patient breath and gold turned to iron and back again, a sound like a bell under salt water marked a passage that was not measured in miles. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had seen what he had needed to see and given what he could afford and kept back only enough to keep walking. The road took him the way good roads do, without argument, without applause, with room for his feet and his thoughts and the tools he carried because he knew how to use them and not because they made him a king. Somewhere behind him, a skald started the first of the new songs and got the meter wrong and left it wrong because it felt truer that way. Somewhere ahead, trouble arranged itself into the kind of puzzle that could be bored into behaving. Between them, a traveler with one bright eye and one honest absence went on, humming a plain note under the cleverness of the world until the cleverness remembered what it was for.